So what would you do with your money? Like, if you were listening to yourself, obviously you have this knowledge. What would you do with your money? Given this knowledge.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're in a phase right now, and this we were already touching on it. Is this fair if you're Janet Yellen? And what's essentially happened, and you can see this in a ton of polls, is that the overall population in the United States trust in government institutions is near an all-time low. And so when it's near an all-time low, the natural propensity historically is for people to move their money away from government and government-regulated institution into harder assets. Those harder assets could be homes, could be warehouses, could be storage facilities, could be independent stocks and bonds, and so forth. And I still think that's why I'm positive on the market, the stock market overall between now and the end of the decade as well, is because you start to see, like you think about the size of the bond market is 10 times the size of the stock market. And so as people start to say, I'm seeing some risk here in the bonds that I hold, especially government-related bonds, I'm going to move those into stocks and bonds that are privately held because I'm starting to trust less the organizations that run that from a government perspective.
Gotcha.
So personally speaking, I'm making investments, like I said, in the harder assets, looking for storage facilities, looking for, I'm still a fan of crypto. So that's one of the areas that I do work in. I still think the housing market, there's a massive shortage of residential housing is still in the short supply. Even though prices are up and interest rates are up, there's still a shortage. So I still think there's an opportunity in the right geographical areas.
Got you. This is kind of, going off the point a bit, but did you see the bill that's being introduced to keep hedge funds from buying single-family homes?
I did see that, yes.
Yeah, and the reason I'm saying I just brought that up is because you're like, hey, as an individual, I would go for hard assets to secure my cash, to secure my financial position. At the same time, previous to this, there are hedge funds of, large investment institutions that have been doing the thing that you're talking about.
Yep.
And I think a lot of them, and I'm just saying that to add credibility to what you're sharing, because for a lot of us, I think when it comes to buying a hard asset or making investments, because we don't fully understand money, we kind of like, I'm just going to leave it where it is. I think it's safer there. And the conversation that we're having is like, what I'm really gaining from this, and I hope the listeners are getting, is that we need to do a much deeper dive into our financial acumen and education to better understand how to protect the little money we have.
If you want to be about it, come on, let's talk about it. Change up the things you see. Open your mind to possibilities. Find your power, passion, and your purpose. It's time for you to walk in greatness. Let's murder mediocrity. Play your goals, live out your dreams.
So, over the past few years, Mr. Lewandowski being a good friend of mine, as I saw things come true, I would send him a text message. Oh, you called this out. And even this morning, I was looking at the thread, and text message after text message with articles back and forth confirming a lot of what he shared. And so because of that, I asked him to join us today to share the 2024 economic outlook. And think of it as 2024 and beyond. And so I'd like to welcome to the airwaves this morning with us, Mr. Jeff Lewandowski. Good morning, brother.
Good morning, Hell Boogie. How's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. Most folks don't know me by that name. but it's going well, man. Excited to have you this morning. Excited to chat the economic forecast, and even what's going on right now economically, but also the economic forecast for 2024 and beyond. And so, real quick first, can you provide a quick introduction for some listeners? This may be the first time that they've heard you on the air. One thing I can share with them about you is that you joined me in 2019 at the Murder Mediocrity Summit to talk work and money. You joined me on the airwaves in 2020 to talk the economic predicament that we were in back then. But what is it that you do professionally, and how might people know you?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. So I lead a company called Andrew Reese Consulting, and actually we're celebrating a milestone here this month, as a matter of fact. So we're 20 years in business.
Wow.
Back in 2004, Andy Maddox and I started Andrew Reese. And it was the two of us. I can probably talk a little bit about that later because I know you've got an entrepreneurial show. It might be an interesting story given that it's such a good milestone. But essentially what we do is we compete directly with companies like Deloitte Consulting, Accenture, Bain, Booz Allen, McKinsey. And it falls within that. They call it the Big Four consulting, essentially. And that's where I cut my teeth. I grew up. I'm going to spend about 6 years at Deloitte Consulting. My business partner, Andy Maddox, that I mentioned, spent his time kind of growing up and figuring out how to do consulting at Accenture. And we had a bit of a niche back in 2004 around the customer experience space. And so in a nutshell, what we do is we work primarily with Fortune 1000 companies, helping to set executive strategies, helping to change the way they do customer experience strategy. We work in call centers quite a bit, figuring out how to make them more operationally efficient. We work within sales groups, marketing, and so forth. And so one of the things we always want to do, and we need to do, for not only our own sake, but for the sake of our clients, is to really be up on micro and macroeconomic trends. And so figuring out what the future looks like, where we think investment's going to be so that we can appropriately advise them, and subsequently we can build new operations and practices within Andrew Reese that will help them and help ourselves to grow. So it's a little bit about me and the company and why we're here today to talk about macroeconomic trends.
Awesome. I love that. And Jeff, you and I met 2005, so we have, I would say, a little under a 20-year relationship. For the listeners, they will get this, but one of the things that drove Jeff and I together was Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich. We found out that we both had an affinity for that shortly after meeting. And I remember often being in the office until the wee hours of the evening, having conversations about just nuggets that we took from Think and Grow Rich and applying that to our lives from a health and wellness perspective, from a relational perspective, and largely we did a lot of talk about money, a lot of talk about money. And for those of you listening, Jeff, often I don't think people really understand like the path towards financial success. And one of the things I found, I believe you'll back this up, is that the path towards financial success is not something you do by yourself. There are always other people who are around you who are smarter than you about a certain financial aspect that you can lean on. You have definitely been one of those people for me. I want to acknowledge you for that. And also share that with the audience because, you're not just somebody I'm having on the show to talk about 2024, the economic outlook, but these are conversations that you and I have had privately. You're someone that whose opinion that I trust privately. And so I wanted to give the gift of that to our audience this morning.
Yeah, no, I can't emphasize enough how those late night conversations come to fruition. As a matter of fact, as I was talking about the milestone with Andrew Reese and celebrating 20 years, one of the things that I've started to do is reach out and kind of a gratitude tour, because as you said, you don't get to these places by yourself. And so what I've started to do is pick up the phone, and I called the first person I called was Ashish Basaria, because he was the very first person to take a chance and give us our very first contract around wireless number portability back in 2004. And so we had a good talk. I've called a couple other people so far. I just started this, but taking it back to your comment around our conversations late night at the office talking about Napoleon Hill, to this day, I still think that all the thousands of books that I've read, his work, Think and Grow Rich, is probably the best book that lays it out. And so,
agreed.
If you haven't, if your listeners haven't gotten into that book, I highly suggest you do it. And I suggest you look at it like a textbook. And so there will be pieces in there as you're reading it where it'll ask you to say, hey, write down, your life goals. I suggest putting the book down and actually taking the time to do that. And by the end of it, you'll have a nice roadmap. And that's, Linnell, you and I have spoken about him for a while. And I'll share this too. So as we're both raising kids, mine are sitting now at age, two boys at age 13 and age 15. And my 15-year-old came to me, I don't know, about a month ago or so, and he's like, Dad, I need to figure out what I'm going to do this summer for a job. So again, he's 15. He's getting ready to really be infatuated with cars, and so he's trying to raise some money to get himself a car. So I said, all right, it looks like you're ready now. And so I gave him one of the old school looking versions of Think and Grow Rich and wrote an inscription on the inside, basically saying the stuff like, I hope you look at this like a textbook, like I said, follow it, and I hope it gives you the success that I know that it's given me. So great stuff around Napoleon Hill.
Awesome. And let me tell you, if anybody's listening and they had a doubt about the book, you just said you gave your firstborn son the book to study. I think that's saying a lot for anybody. So, it's one thing to make a recommendation, you should read this, but then to back it up and say, by the way, I gave it to my firstborn just a moment ago.
Yep, exactly right.
Yeah, that's a big deal. And so, well, thanks for sharing that. And I mean, it's also, like I said, one of the things that brought us together. And since then, many conversations just to share another piece of acknowledgement about you. I can remember you're talking about Ashish Basaria, who gave you an opportunity. He gave me my opportunity to lead on a large scale. The first corporate America leader that gave me the opportunity to lead on a large scale. So I think we both owe him a debt of gratitude. I mean, maybe we need to surprise him in Atlanta, take him to dinner, Jeff, you and I.
I know. I'll actually be there next week.
Really? Well, I'm not going to join you because I'll be a little further south on the island. So,
yep.
But maybe next time. But what I was going to share is just this notion around, I can remember being in a deep conversation with a C-suite executive and trying to figure out how to close that sale. And after leaving that lunch, you were the person I called. I don't know if you remember that phone call. It was some years ago, back maybe 2019. But I was like, how do you close, when you got the person right there? And Jeff Lewandowski is who I called. So I'm really looking forward to Jeff having the opportunity to share more with you all. Now, Jeff, the first thing I want to do is I want to share some credibility, and simply by sharing a soundbite of something that you shared about the work from home event all the way back in 2020. And so I want to share that soundbite really quickly so the audience can kind of just get a feel for, one, what you shared before, like if they didn't hear it before, or some people need to be reminded. If they didn't hear it, completely before, they have an opportunity now to be like, oh, wow, okay, he predicted that. So as we get, a bit later into the show and you begin to share some of the predictions you have for 2024 and beyond, they kind of get where you're coming from, and they also get the credibility that you have in terms of what you offer. And so real quick, I want to share this soundbite, and And just to give some context, this particular soundbite, you're talking about the four main impacts of the work from home event. And this is 2020. So think 60 days into the pandemic. And at this point, Jeff, you and I, neither one of us have had a haircut in 2 months.
Yep.
And many of the listeners haven't had a haircut. Many of the ladies hadn't had their hair dyed or done. And so we're all kind of sheltering in place in our homes. And you're at home, with your team looking at just data. And this is what you shared about the data you all have found on the work from home event at that time.
Again, a little bit deeper, but there are certainly four primary impacts to what, again, I'll call the work from home event. The first one is, as we've been talking about, on the office real estate space. So again, number 4 in global GDP, or global revenue, rather.
Right.
So you got to think about that. Most of this office space has banknotes underneath it. So now we're impacting the banking sector, which, by the way, is number 9 in global revenue.
And let me just say, you talked about how commercial real estate, office spaces here were impacting the banking sector. We've already seen some banks fall. One of the things I want to talk about in the second hour are, what you believe is going to happen to small banks in the next 4 to 5 years, because it's, 4 years later, it's really coming to fruition. So, check there. Definitely on point. Let's continue to listen.
Getting about the bars and the restaurants that surround these office parks that are counting on a vibrant lunch crowd or an after-work happy hour crowd. Mm-hmm. Then you think about the pure profit.
Okay, so there, the second point that you were making there, Jeff, for the listeners, because you know the points you were making, but for the listeners, just, hey, one of the other impacts we're going to see is around, restaurants in particular. And if I'm not mistaken, you have data now to basically prove what you were suggesting back then, that restaurants have taken a fairly significant hit as a result of the pandemic and the work from home event. But there's more.
Property taxes that are coming off of these office spaces that go to fund the public works.
Whoa.
So that's probably the biggest one.
So then you have all these taxes from commercial real estate, restaurants, and downtown areas that fund public works. You talked about that. We're going to definitely get into that in a little bit, but how that impacts public works. One of the things I was sharing, just by the way, is, think about our mayor Johnson, Brandon Johnson, right? African-American mayor. I wouldn't have run if I were him. Because, and you already know why I'm saying that, because he's going to have to deal with things that he didn't do. And he'll likely get blamed for a lot of the reduction in revenue and public works that takes place during his term that was going to happen anyway. But let's continue. Let's keep continuing.
Thinking about the second one here is around the commute to the office. So everybody knows those pictures, especially if you live in Chicago. Trying to the commute in downtown is long, congested, and there's a lot of gas that gets spent on that. And so the decrease in demand for gas will impact the oil and gas industry perhaps forever. The next one is on auto sales. If you're not driving as much and you can work from home, perhaps you're going to keep your car a little longer. That is going to impact auto sales, which, by the way, is number 3 in total revenue.
Check. I mean, auto sales, like the automobile industry has significantly shifted. I know that well because I'm in the game, having part ownership and founding of a car rental company where we have to keep a fresh fleet, buying cars, multiple cars, lots of cars every year. Man, has the industry changed. Thanks for that advice, brother, because we bit into that and made the best of it. But there's a little bit more.
And then lastly, business travel. So the Zoom environment that we're in, or Zoom being the technology that people use as video streaming, and they're saying, well, you know what, maybe I don't have to get together for that convention as frequently as I used to in Las Vegas or Chicago or anywhere that you've done it before, which is going to have a ripple effect on auto rentals, hotels, airlines. And we can.
All right, so that's a little bit. I'm curious, what comments do you have, Jeff, listening to yourself? And it might be something you want to, another prediction you want to share right off the bat. But what comes up for you?
Yeah, thinking about the last one for sure, if you take a look at global GDP, one of the big winners over the last 4 years has been essentially, I call it the telecom and internet infrastructure business. They've shot to the very top of the list globally. Mm-hmm. And so that last one about the way that people conduct business is certainly came to massive fruition.
Jeff, is it
commercial?
Is it?
Yeah, go ahead.
What was the global wireless telecommunications industry even in the top 10 in 2020?
They were not in the top 10 on the outfit that put that together. I think that's IBIS.
Yes.
Where I got that information. They weren't even in the top 10.
And now they are number one globally. Number one. Global. And I remember back then, people were making their investments in Zoom. They're like, Zoom is way up. Like you saw these telecommunication stocks start to soar. Is this something that for you're doubling down on in the coming years? Like, is this a trend that you see changing, or you believe that it's going to continue to grow?
I think it's going to continue to grow, Linnell. I'm thinking about, this is one of the items that I was going to say for the, what do we do? How do we change? I'll go ahead and throw this out now as kind of a nugget prior to that part of the conversation. But I don't know if you've watched the commercials or even the social media videos of people capturing this with the Apple Vision Pro. So if you're not familiar with it, the Apple Vision Pro is kind of a new set of virtual reality goggles that are different than the ones in the past, because with the Apple Vision Pro, you can actually see your own surroundings. And what Apple has figured out a way to do is almost make it look like, if you can remember that movie Minority Report, where they were moving screens around that weren't physical. They were in these goggles and these headsets, and they kind of like could do all of that. If you haven't seen it, go check it out, because you can actually, it basically makes your desk in space, like in the air, and you can move things around, experience virtual reality in a panoramic way. And so what I think that we're getting closer to is that what has been discussed, I think, probably for the last decade, which is just this concept of really immersing yourself in Web3, or really that new way of doing business where you don't have to go anywhere. You can experience a vacation from a headset and get a lot of the visual stimulation that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to get. So I do think that that's a trend. I do think that if you take a look at a lot of the global think tanks like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and some of the things that they're pushing and incentivizing, that's still going to be a major area of opportunity for investment.
Got you. 2020, it's tough to, kind of go back and even bring up some of the anxiety we felt, some of the uncertainty we felt during that time. But all of us felt it. We knew it. And you talked about the economic outlook back in 2020 on shopping, in particular the commercial real estate. And we talked about the oil and gas sector, as we heard, car sales, auto manufacturing, and auto parts. And even still to this day, car manufacturers are still waiting, or dealers are waiting on auto parts, things like that. So there's certain sectors that still haven't recovered. One of the questions that I have for you in terms of just this overall outlook is, since 2020, we talked about telecommunications jumping to the top. How else has these global industries, these global leaders, how else has overall revenue within these industries changed? And what is your take on why?
Yeah, so the interesting part, you mentioned one of them. So you're still waiting on parts for some of these vehicles. Now, what that's done is it's actually kept revenue higher than it probably would have been otherwise out of simple supply and demand. So now they can't get the parts made, they can't get the parts shipped, and so those parts are more expensive than they would have been otherwise. And so some of those revenue impacts are interesting. If you look at it as total parts shipped versus before 2020, you're going to see probably a decrease in overall items there. However, the price points are much higher than they were. So it's interesting to see. Like I know your audience are full of entrepreneurs in here, people that probably feel this on a daily basis. But I can't tell you a restaurant that I've been into, maybe with a few exceptions, but most of the restaurants that I've been into are you have to wait 20 minutes to an hour simply because they don't have the staff. So it's not because they don't have the capacity in the building; it's because they don't have the people to work it. And for whatever reason, I think that that's going to continue to be an issue where you see a lack of supply of actual labor, as well as, some of those reasons are why you couldn't get the items shipped and they weren't available. So those are the key pieces there. There's a really interesting thing happening in CRE, and I think that as we get into the second hour here, that'll probably be the focus of the conversation, because I think those will be the biggest ripples and probably the biggest opportunities that we see. We're going to be in that commercial real estate space, and subsequently the impacts that it's going to have on specifically regional and smaller sized banks.
So let's well, before we go there, this is linked to it, but I know many of my listeners are mature. You could call them in terms of generationally baby boomers. And I could wait to the end of the show to pose this question to keep them on the edge of their seats. But I think there's a whole lot that we're going to be talking about that if a person has financial interest, then they're going to keep listening. And the question I have about baby boomers in particular is for, given... And maybe we need to set the stage a bit more for this. So I'm trying to think, before I just jump into that, let's talk real quickly about this commercial real estate problem. I sent you a text message, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, Jeff?
Yeah, I think so.
About a particular commercial real estate investor who's down, listen to this, $1 trillion. That's, yeah. That's significant. Can you, just for the benefit of the listeners, because when you get into, figures like that, I think sometimes we don't fully understand. We know it's a lot of money. But in terms of the United States GDP, can you just share the overall financial value of the United States GDP?
Yeah, so I can share that the let me just put it in overall commercial real estate, it's in the top 5 in terms of total global GDP or GNP rather. Mm-hmm. So the size of this stuff is big, but it's also a bigger story. So while the office space side is in a massive world of hurt, the warehousing side is booming. And that goes to the shifting and all the things that happen with e-commerce side of things. So everybody's buying warehouse space. If you owned warehouse space prior to 2020, you were in the right side of the trade. Also considered part of the whole global CRE or commercial real estate space. Mm-hmm. And then the other side that's hurting a little bit but has come back, I think, as we talked about in 2020, is the retail side of it. We're a social animal. We cooped ourselves up for a while, but at the end of the day, we have a need to interact and kind of be in those spaces. So while it's not doing incredibly well on the retail side, it's doing better than office space.
Got you. So then the piece that's really hurting because I believe commercial real estate was ranked where in 2020? I think it dropped maybe one
It
position.
was number 4.
Yeah.
Yep, it was number 4. So the overall value was generally the same, but again, there was a big shift in where that revenue was being generated, primarily coming from the warehousing sector.
Got you. And then now it's number 5.
That's right.
And so the impact that we're seeing for commercial real estate in particular is coming from office space.
That's correct.
Okay. And that is a result of the work from home event.
That's correct. And as a matter of fact, some of the I think I sent you a slide. One of them that we can talk about is that since the vacancy rate for office space was measured, it started measuring it in 1979. And since its inception of the vacancy measure, it is at an all-time low.
Got you. At an all-time. So that's the piece I want to talk about, because I think a lot of us aren't paying it. Like, if I'm, let's say, baby boomer, 5 years away from retirement, a trillionaire just lost $1 trillion. I don't, what do I care? And this is where I was going. If I'm not mistaken, Jeff, you dropped the figure in 2020 around the United States overall GDP. I think it was like 25, don't quote me completely, but in the 20 trillions.
Yeah, that's correct.
And recently I was looking at some data on our debt. And if I'm not mistaken, the United States currently has a debt of about 35 trillion.
Yeah, it's right around there, depending on how you calculate it. 32, 35 trillion is that.
Okay, I'm going somewhere with this. So for a commercial real estate investor to lose $1 trillion, while we think that has nothing to do with us, that's fairly significant. And as I have learned, here we go. U.S. national debt stands at 31.5 trillion. Thanks for that. So I did just put the shot. Put that back up too, so people can really take a look at that. But the United States national debt stands at 31.5 trillion, and that's a slide that you sent us, Jeff.
Yep, correct.
We are generating maybe 25 to 30 trillion a year. That, by the way, is not going towards the debt. But one of the areas where there's been a significant fallout in revenue is commercial real estate. And while warehouses, like you said, and retail centers have somewhat rebounded, or warehouses are booming, commercial real estate in terms of office space is not. What is the trickle effect to the common person? Because, we see these things sometimes in the media, watching CNN. It's like, another rich man lost some money. I don't care. But how does that end up impacting the individual who's 5 years from retirement?
Yeah. So it depends on what that individual is doing. But as we talked about, as people are at the office less, there's that whole office park economy. So the restaurants that are around that you go to either lunch or you go to happy hour at, the dry cleaner that's on the way to the office that you're not going to anymore because essentially no one has to do that. So if you own one of those businesses and you're in a spot where you're looking to retire, you talked about, I think in 2020, you've got to really take a new look at your business model. I think, again, one of the ones, we talked about restaurants that closed. The ones that thrived were the ones that changed their business model and became more of a delivery business. And I know, for example, Wingstop as a corporate strategy has changed from a sit-down environment to, look, it's going to be takeout or delivery. And I actually have a friend who's investing in several of those right now, and he's working to make it so it's removing all of the tables. So again, changing the way it goes. Thinking about the retirement savings that the baby boomer might have. I definitely, if you haven't already exited office space CRE, I would certainly do that. My take is that will get worse before it gets better. And out of every crisis, there's going to be most likely an opportunity that's about later. But if you're owning those REITs right now, or I maybe own it directly, it's going to be a rough road to hoe. Talking about positive side, I think technology wins. I think if you shift over and you start to take a look at the technology technology pieces that we talked about, Zoom, Apple, those types of things are going to do much better. And honestly, Linnell, one of the things, we talk about all these doom and gloom things that are happening around CRE. I still think that we are looking at a very good stock market environment between now and probably the top of 2030.
Okay. So let me come back to the CRE space, like this commercial real estate space. Is it safe to say that if I have, and this might be a question you like, Linnell, I'm not going to answer that, but is it safe to say that if I have a mutual fund or a fund that's being managed, and because if I'm not mistaken, correct me, Jeff, one of the areas, and I know we're going to get into this in deep detail in the second hour, but one of the areas that many small banks, mutual funds, et cetera, invested in prior to 2020 was CRE, commercial real estate.
Yes, that's correct. And I forgot my famous disclaimer, so I'll go ahead and throw that out now. So while I spend a lot of time in the macro and microeconomic environments, I'm not a financial advisor, and this is not financial advice, so make sure you're getting that from somebody who's approved to do that. But I will tell you what I'm doing, and that's kind of how this conversation goes. So to your question specifically, it's an interesting makeup when it comes to CRE, commercial real estate, in that the majority of loans that are given for those types of investments are coming from small banks, not big ones. So there is a slide that I think I sent over there, which actually has a breakdown of what that looks like. And currently 70% of all outstanding commercial real estate loans are coming from banks that are not listed at the top 25. And so when you think about who is going to have the most exposure and subsequently what's going to happen to those if a lender walks away, I think we talked about people walking away from real estate in 2008 in our last conversation we had. Mm-hmm. Similar things are already happening with large portfolios of commercial real estate specific to the office side. And they're walking away. The bank gets that. The bank then needs to either resell it, or that bank is in jeopardy of essentially going out of business. And so 70% of those loans that are for commercial real estate are currently coming out of the non-top 25 banks by size.
Got you. So small banks holding commercial real estate loans, many of those loans being defaulted on, in the process of being defaulted on, something that if what I'm hearing you say that, like if you were, and again, this is, you're not a financial advisor. This is kind of like a public conversation that, we typically would have privately, right, for the benefit of the listeners. But, would you say like, hey, you might want to be really clear about where your investments are if retirement's around the corner? I would say even if it's not.
Yeah, no question, especially if retirement's around the corner, because that means you're going to need to tap into it. You're going to need to utilize it for income because you're no longer going to be at either a W-2 job, or maybe you're going to sell your business if you have it. So you're going to have less fluctuations in that portfolio than you would be if you basically had a 20-year horizon to your retirement.
Got you. Well, you could recover. And I know just from having known you as long as I have, Jeff, you don't believe in recovering. You believe in avoiding the dip.
Yep.
Completely.
Very
and keeping the money you have so you can continue to grow that faster, which, I think comes with, a certain amount of savvy. I want, if you may, to start with the work that you all did at Andrew Reese around the work from home event. I had another clip I was going to play, but I think that you can revisit it live. I was going to play this clip of, kind of predicting everything that's happened now in terms of working from home. But you sent me a slide last evening about, how many employees feel about the work from home event, and then consequently the trickle down effect of that. You mind sharing what you shared with me about how things have significantly shifted since 2020, now that we're in 2024, and how the impact of working from home has impacted employees and ultimately employers.
Yeah, absolutely. So early on in the COVID, literally March of 2020, so about as early as it got, I think the actual lockdowns for most cities happened in March. And so it was kind of a brand new thing. And there was a poll that went out that said, what do you think about working from home on a full-time basis, even beyond the pandemic? Mm-hmm. And at that time, more than half, just slightly more than half, 51%, said, yeah, I want this to be my default scenario, is to work from home or kind of a more flexible working environment than coming into the office. 32% said no, I want more office time. And then there was a group that probably I would assume more people than this would have actually sat in. About 17% said, you know what, this is too early to tell. I'm just kind of getting into this. I don't know what I think of it. So fast forward to 2023, Gallup did a poll, similar question. So moving forward, in a post-COVID lockdown environment, do you want to continue working from home? And then now that has increased substantially, or significantly rather. So 59% are saying, yes, I want a flexible work environment that may sometimes include an office, but the majority of the time I want to be able to have flexibility to work from home or to work from anywhere. Mm-hmm. While 41% said they wanted more of an office time. So the interesting part about that is digging in, and it was usually the younger workers that actually were on the side of I want to be in an office. And a lot of those reasons that were provided were I'm not getting the mentoring that you can get when you walk down the hall and you actually sit in somebody's office.
Oh, interesting.
And there was also a social aspect. So a lot of the younger workers were saying, look, this is a social outlet as well as a job, and I want to be able to interact more face-to-face with my colleagues. And so I think that you'll find there's definite age breakdown between these two, with the younger skewing to wanting an office environment, and more of the baby boomers skewing to, I want the flexibility to work from anywhere. If I want to grab my laptop, if I can do it anyway, if I have a job where I can do this. I want to go to the beach, and I'll get my work done and my video calls done, and then I'll take that walk on the beach.
So the younger worker is interested in this. The older worker is kind of like, I've built my networks, I'm good, my career is steady. Don't necessarily, and by the way, the workplace is dominated by the more mature worker right now. And so we've already talked about like how this has impacted commercial real estate. One of the things you talked about was economic contact tracing. Can you explain that term first and then break down the work that you all did around economic contact tracing?
Yeah, absolutely. We used that term, borrowed it from contact tracing that was associated with COVID at the time. And so they used contact tracing as a term to say who have you been in contact with that has had COVID, who have they been in contact with, to try to make predictions on how many more people this would impact and so forth. So I borrowed that term and said, not only within human-to-human contact and the actual virus is there contact tracing, but there are also trickle-down activities that happen from an economic perspective. Mm-hmm. And so the large downstream impacts, I think the slide that I sent over just talks about how that goes. And I think the most impactful one, as we've been talking about the first hour, is related to office real estate. And so I mentioned earlier, but it's the whole ecosystems that exist around an office park completely were impacted. So restaurants, dry cleaners, hairstylists, that all sat around that trip to work. The gas stations, convenience stores that were on the way that don't get that foot traffic anymore, all of those have been significantly impacted. Then you get...
And Jeff, just to pause on that, because... for those of us in Chicago, we may not fully see that impact, but like if you travel to a San Francisco, the last time I was out in San Francisco with a client, and you have the wharf, right, which is Fisherman's Wharf, which is like previous to 2020, like famed for all the different retail stores and restaurants in the area. Now, when you walk down Fisherman's Wharf, it's like it looks decimated. And there are a few brands that are still, you take like the Levi's store, right? Well, I mean, Levi's headquarters are in San Francisco. The Levi's store is going to be okay. That's real estate that they're going to make sure, that they pay for it through the pandemic because it just made sense for them. But many other locations, gone. And it feels weird to walk through like a touristy area and see, open for lease signs. But I wanted to give that perspective because if we have listeners who don't travel like you and I, they might go, what is he talking about? I haven't seen exactly what he's saying, but there are parts of cities like San Francisco and other cities like that, definitely tier 2 and tier 3 cities, where you overwhelmingly see the impact of the pandemic still playing out. So I just want to drop that in. So then what's the impact of that, right? You have the big brands that can last through, and a lot of that has to do with their cash sheets. I imagine the Italian restaurant was probably, pushing a lot of catering, and like they shifted their business model, right? Which is one of the, at the end of 2020 show, you gave us some advice. And one of the big pieces of advice that you gave us was to conserve cash. And then the second big piece was to take a look at your business model if you're an entrepreneur. So I would imagine that they took a look at their business model, probably started doing a lot more delivery, they were able to survive. But now you say 70, 75% of the retail locations that used to be there are gone. So then that's money somebody's not getting. What does that lead to?
Yeah, so I think if you go to the slide around the share of loans held, this was mentioned in the first hour, but commercial real estate loans, which again includes three big buckets: retail space, office space, and warehouse. All of those together, a major exposure is within the small banks. And so why does that matter? There's two reasons. So a bank is required to maintain certain ratios, and those ratios are how much cash do I have in the form of demand deposits, or deposits that people like you and I would, maybe take $500 to the bank, deposit it, that's a demand deposit. And on the other side, they have the loan portfolio. So there needs to be ratios of demand deposits to the loan portfolio in order to pass regulatory requirements. And every night, these banks try to see where they're at with these ratios and borrow money if they need, or give excess cash that they have for other people to borrow. So interestingly enough, this used to be a well-oiled machine where the banks used to loan to each other overnight. And there's even a thing called the overnight rate with which they do that. The trust that most of these institutions have in each other's ability to stay solvent has decreased substantially, and I think it's been in play now since 2019, where these banks don't trust each other, so the Fed is now in the middle with a reverse repo, where they basically are lending those excesses or taking the excesses where they exist. So the reason I bring that up, a little bit of understanding, is when a piece of commercial real estate, focusing on office, is no longer worth what it once was when the bank loaned for it, that's a hit to what the asset looks like on the bank's balance sheet. Further, when interest rates rise, let's just say that a bank provided a loan for 3.5%, 4% on the office part. So they loaned $500,000. They've got this money coming in, and then interest rates rise like they did. So the Federal Reserve controls interest rates, essentially the rate that they charge other banks to borrow. When you can now get a commercial real estate loan for 7.5%, that reduces the value of the $500,000 loan that sits on the bank's balance sheet. So what that does...
Okay, so let's break this down, because you had a chart and it was the impact of a monthly mortgage. Was that a great way to break this down for listeners to understand?
Yes, for sure. And so there's two things to look at. Let's first look at the one that says impact on bank assets.
Okay, impact on bank assets.
Yeah, because this is where it goes back to what does it mean when commercial real estate, I'll use specifically office space, no longer worth what it's worth.
Mm-hmm.
So a bank has a $500,000 loan. They basically give somebody else the $500,000 loan. They take that loan and they use it as an asset on their books. Let's just say the original interest rate that they loaned that $500,000 at was at 3.5%.
Okay, so that would be previous to 2022, or
Yeah, and this happened quick. I mean, the increase from 2021 to now is one of the fastest increases since 1980. And so,
say that again, Jeff, so people really get this. Like, this is one of the fastest increases in interest rates on money, or the cost of money, since the 80s. Since the 80s. And let's be clear, who was the last president? I'm not going to do that. Anyway, so I was going to say, who did that happen under? But I'm not going to do that. People can go Google it. But because this is not a political show, but I think it's important for us to understand that often in politics do impact our money.
Yes.
So we can get back to the sheet here. So bank loan, $500,000, interest rate, previous to 2022 was 3.5. Fastest interest rate increase, or fastest cost of money increase since the 80s. Now we're sitting at about 7.5%. Continue, please. Sorry.
Yes. So now you're a bank. You have this note for $500,000 as an asset, but the interest rate is only 3.5%. Now, if that bank was going to write a new loan for $500,000, they'd be getting 7.5%. So that has a negative impact on the asset on the bank's balance sheet. So that original $500,000 loan, let's just assume that somebody simply paid the interest and the overall value of the loan is still sitting at $500,000.
Mm-hmm.
If they were going to this bank was going to go and sell that loan to another bank, they would have to do it at a discount, because they used what's called a discounted cash flow model to evaluate what the value of that $500,000 loan would be.
So can we just pause here? I want to make sure listeners are coming along. And I'm also going to look at the comments here just to make sure everybody is following. And so if you have questions about what Jeff is sharing, please put it in the comments. But so far, no questions. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Somebody said, a lot of commercial balloon loans are coming due. All right. So now I want to make sure that people really get what you're saying. So now, if I take a loan, or if I had a loan and I'm looking to move that original loan, I actually am losing money as a bank.
Correct. So let's assume you're the bank, you're Linnell Bank. You gave the original $500,000 loan a year ago, 3.5%.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm Jeff Bank. I'm in the business of buying loans from other banks. I'm only going to offer you $481,000 for your original $500,000, because interest rates have risen, and a discounted cash flow for future cash flow makes your $500,000. You just lost basically $18,000 on the loan you made a year ago.
Got it. Now, the reason I want people to get this is because often the banks that we do business with to get our home mortgage is not the bank we end up paying long term. And so this is very natural for banks to sell off mortgage loans. And what you're saying is this natural activity, previous to 2021, et cetera, is no longer as natural as it used to be.
Exactly right. And again, with the fastest increase, you have a absolute whiplash for risk management in banking institutions, and that you haven't seen since 1980.
So explain that. When you say an absolute whiplash, when I think about whiplash, I think about, sitting at a stop sign and getting hit, right? Somebody hitting me and I didn't know it, and it yanks my neck, and it causes significant pain. Now I have to go to rehab. Are you saying that the equivalent of that is happening to small banks all through America?
Yes, and it's for this reason. So the impact on banks, they're what they consider assets. They consider loans assets. The value of their loans that they made even a year ago has dropped 3.5+% in value. So they need to do one of two things. They either need to sell those assets or they need to get more people to make demands deposits or to put money in the bank. They have to maintain the ratios. If they don't, they fall under the situation of potential insolvency, and that's where Janet Yellen and company will come in and hopefully try to set up a sale of their assets or a merger with another bank.
So let's talk about this situation with Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary Yellen of the Fed, and if I'm not mistaken, it was last year she made this comment, right?
That's correct. Right about the time you started to see three major banks fail, he came out. This is when that happened.
Right, and this is right about the time where Silicon Valley went down,
Yep.
Along with two others.
That's correct.
And so
I'll
go ahead, please.
No. I was just going to give a little background on it. So this does go back to our previous conversation we had 4 years ago related to the 2008 financial crisis. So just to recap on that a little bit, the banks were in massive trouble in 2008. They had to be bailed out. They were bailed out with public taxpayer funds, somewhere around $1 trillion, to help them maintain solvency and some of these things that we're talking about here. So there was an outrage by the public. Why are the banks getting bailed out? Where's my bailout? And so naturally gets politicians doing what politicians do. And Senators Dodd and Senator Frank came together following the crisis, became what's called Dodd-Frank. So Dodd-Frank changed the way banking law works. And they basically said, the law is now, you banks will no longer be bailed out by taxpayers. They will be bailed in, meaning that assets of the bank will be the first thing that are liquidated to the shareholders and so forth. Now, the very important part of this, and the most impactful part to people like you and I, is that it changed our relationship with the bank. So when we go and we deposit $1,000 in the bank, per the Dodd-Frank legislation, the law says we do not own that $1,000. We have a ledger that says we have a claim on it, but that is now a bank asset. And if the bank were to fail tomorrow, that $1,000 is going to the creditors of the bank first, not to you or I. We then need to rely on what's called FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to cover that amount. That coverage is only $250,000 per customer. So
hold on. Let's pause. Let's pause, because this is a big deal.
Yep.
Now, if I only got $5,000 in the bank, I still think it's a big deal. Partly because I now have to wait for an insurance claim.
Correct.
Right? And I don't have room in my finances to wait. So, just in case somebody was like, oh, he said $250,000, that's not me. It's like, yeah, you should still listen, though. But then for listeners who maybe have, because there are listeners who have $300,000, $400,000 sitting in one account, what would you say your immediate advice is to them?
Yes, my immediate advice is exactly what we did. So this is probably going to pertain to your listeners who are running a payroll, have a business where they need to run a payroll.
100%.
So the FDIC insurance today does not cover anything over $250,000. So let's just say I have $500,000 in my bank account. It goes bankrupt tomorrow. The maximum amount I will get from insurance is $250,000, and the other $250,000 is gone. So my advice is what we did with our companies. Our payrolls are larger than $250,000, And so we needed to have reserves. And so what we did was we decided to hedge our risk here by utilizing U.S. Treasuries. And so you can get different dates, maturity dates on U.S. Treasuries. We decided to go with the shortest date possible, which is essentially a 28-day Treasury. So you put your money into U.S. Treasuries, and they pay you back 28 days later at a pre-specified rate. So there is no FDIC-like insurance or risk that'll be there unless the U.S. government goes insolvent, which is a whole separate issue, but I think much further down the road. So we use, it's very easy. You can actually go directly from your bank account to treasurydirect.gov, and you can get regular movement back and forth between your excess cash in the bank and the treasuries in order to hedge situations where you have to have more than $250,000 in a bank account.
Got you. There is something else that I've done, Jeff, and there are some banking organizations out there who basically partner with different banks to separate your money. So I can hold more than $250,000 in an account, but they separate the money to make sure that it's insured, while giving me, let's say, 5% or more on that money. I don't know if you've heard of Betterment, but it's one of the organizations that does that. And I have direct access where I can transfer funds, within 24 hours back and forth the same way. And I'm saying that because just to give options, right? You got U.S. Treasuries, you have organizations like Betterment, and I believe they're insured up to $2 million. But how they do that, how they play that game, is that basically they're making a few percent off the money because they're sending it out to, I believe, and probably like CDs and notes to other banks, and then that way all your money's insured.
No, that's a great idea as well.
Yeah.
And if you take a look,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, look at this comment that Janet Yellen made. So again, thinking about the way that things went in 2008, all the banks were covered. Mm-hmm. Now, by law, all the banks are not covered. However, they put this caveat. Janet Yellen and others have put this caveat out that says, right, where it's circled there, that not all banks will be covered beyond that $250,000. But they will make the decision on who they cover based on their own interpretation, along with Treasury, their own interpretation of which banks serve the most systematic risk. The systematic risk meaning biggest risk to the economy if they go down. And so if you take a look at the slide that's right above that, that's essentially what you saw. She made that comment in March. We had the banks go down in March of last year, those three, Silicon Valley Bank being the most popular one that people know about. And so when Janet Yellen said, basically, I'm going to save some, I'm going to decide who I save, not all are going to be saved. You started seeing a massive shift. So you can see the red line and the green line. Mm-hmm. Essentially what that's showing you is money moving from small banks into the big banks. The big banks like Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo. Those will the big six will most likely be the banks that are considered a systematic risk and subsequently saved. And so now you've got that shift, that particular measure like you've talked about, and that I've talked about with Treasury Direct, and you've seen it drain from the smaller banks. So this kind of compounds and exacerbates the issue because the majority of loans for office space are held by small banks. Now, simultaneously, their money is being drained because of essentially Janet Yellen's commentary and what exists in Dodd-Frank law.
So, Jeff, a couple of things to unpack here. Because obviously, if I'm the Treasury Secretary and you're my friend and you run a bank, you're going to be a preferred bank. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm just saying how I would do it, okay?
Yep.
So that's one piece, right? So that also gets to the whole issue of fairness, et cetera, et cetera. We're not here to debate that. I don't think we're in a position to debate that. What I'm concerned about is the impact on consumers, the people who are listening. Like, what do we make of this as an American citizen who has trusted the banking institution in the United States of America, for a long time, and in particular, African Americans, who, by the way, have had some negative, like I think about my grandmother who was like, I don't trust no banks. And by the way, had good reason to, because, she lost banks in the Jim Crow, lost money in banks in the Jim Crow South. And you think about Freedman's Bank that went insolvent and none of the African Americans got their money. Like, how do we process this? How would you suggest that we process this?
Yeah, and what I see as part of the the predictions and so forth, I believe that this leads office space, commercial real estate issues will lead to insolvencies in small banks. Those smaller banks will be absorbed into the larger ones. There will be a smaller pool, and as that pool, I think it will continue to shrink probably between now and the end of the decade here. And so you're going to have less options, you're going to have bigger banks, and you're going to have probably more government control and oversight of those banks as additional laws come into play. Like you said, not in a position to say, whether it's right or wrong, but ultimately, I'm a free market economist, so I believe that more options are better than less options. So I don't like what I'm seeing, but I'm not sure, outside of the protections that we've talked about, how else to address it.
So what would you do with your money? Like, if you were listening to yourself, obviously you have this knowledge, what would you do with your money, given this knowledge?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're in a phase right now, and this we were already touching on it. Is this fair if you're Janet Yellen? And what's essentially happened, and you can see this in a ton of polls, is that the overall population in the United States, trust in government institutions, is near an all-time low. And so when it's near an all-time low, the natural propensity historically is for people to move their money away from government and government-regulated institution into harder assets. Those harder assets could be homes, could be warehouses, could be storage facilities, could be independent stocks and bonds, and so forth. And I still think that's why I'm positive on the market, the stock market overall, between now and the end of the decade as well, is because you start to see, like, you think about the size of the bond market is 10 times the size of the stock market. And so as people start to say, I'm seeing some risk here in the bonds that I hold, especially government-related bonds, I'm going to move those into stocks and bonds that are privately held, because I'm starting to trust less the organizations that run that from a government perspective.
Gotcha.
So personally speaking, I'm making investments, like I said, in the harder assets, looking for storage facilities, looking for, I'm still a fan of crypto. So that's one of the areas that I do work in. I still think the housing market, there's a massive shortage of residential housing is still in the short supply. Even though prices are up and interest rates are up, there's still a shortage. So I still think there's an opportunity in the right geographical areas.
Got you. This is kind of, going off the point a bit, but did you see the bill that's being introduced to keep hedge funds from buying single-family homes?
I did see that, yes.
Yeah, and the reason I'm saying I just brought that up is because you're like, hey, as an individual, I would go for hard assets to secure my cash, to secure my financial position. At the same time, previous to this, there are hedge funds of, large investment institutions that have been doing the thing that you're talking about.
Yep.
And I think a lot of them, and I'm just saying that to add credibility to what you're sharing, because for a lot of us, I think when it comes to buying a hard asset or making investments, because we don't fully understand money, we kind of like, I'm just going to leave it where it is. I think it's safer there. And the conversation that we're having is like, what I'm really gaining from this, and I hope the listeners are getting, is that we need to do a much deeper dive into our financial acumen and education to better understand how to protect the little money we have. I'm going back to this whole thing around a small bank, $5,000. It is under $250,000, but that bank, I only have a claim to it. It's no longer my money. If the bank goes insolvent, now I have to wait on an insurance claim. And when I think about a family that's making $40,000, $50,000 a year, and they got $5,000 saved, they can't afford to wait on the insurance claim.
No, absolutely.
And so what I hear you saying is let's get a little more savvy in terms of how we're holding money, how we're saving money. And one of the ways to do that is in hard assets. Are there any other hard assets outside of real estate that, that you're interested in, or on a personal level you would invest in, given this knowledge?
Yeah, you're hearing all your commercials out there about silver and gold. I do have some silver and gold. I think it's good to hold simply because it usually maintains an even level and it's not as volatile. The argument against it is it's a pretty rock that doesn't generate any interest for you unless you loan it out to somebody, or doesn't generate any rent. I generally kind of agree with that. I think the assets that you want to look for are ones that can actually generate income for you versus something that's going to appreciate potentially in value. But that's another one. Again, I think if you're looking at stocks and bonds, I think there'll be a slight. One of the things we haven't talked about here is international unrest. So another thing that happens in international unrest, and specifically the war activity going on in the Middle East and going on in the Ukraine, what happened during World War II was the major theaters were in the Pacific and in Europe. And so what people did was they moved their assets to the United States. And so what that caused was a major influx of funds in the United States, and so subsequently U.S.-based assets increased. So you're seeing the same thing right now from an international money flow perspective. Where you have conflict, money flees, and it goes to areas that it doesn't have conflict. And so thinking about that, the areas that primarily international players are buying in the United States, they're buying the Dow mutual funds and the Dow company. So it's kind of you're seeing this movement to the quality, or what's considered the highest quality stocks. And I see that continuing as we move forward, because I do not see anything being resolved on international conflict level anytime soon.
No, that's going to continue to play through the election cycle here. I'm looking at the chart you sent. One of the things that we haven't talked much about is this commercial to residential conversion. So now, first, is there anything else you would share about how you would move your money before we go to commercial to residential conversion? Because I think this might be a great way to end the show. I know one of the things that is talked a lot about here on WVON is the immigration opportunity / issue / problem that many of us are navigating now in the United States. And, in a lot of ways, the disappointment in how it's being handled with the government, in contrast to how we handle, let's say, homeless citizens, which I think many people are finding, fascinating, and they're somewhat enraged by, right? And one of the things that you and I spoke about was this commercial to residential conversion. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so we'll start, if I can, with the discussion around the United Nations. I mentioned earlier. So United Nations is a major think tank. You can go to their website and you can see what their ideas are. The World Economic Forum, or WEF, a major global think tank that is incredibly influential. They're the ones, if anybody listens to CNBC, when the big Davos meeting happens, that's the World Economic Forum doing that week-long Davos exchange of ideas and so forth. It's some of the most powerful people in the world that are attending that, and essentially working to come up with global policy that is adopted. You see a lot primarily across Western countries.
Hey, Jeff, can I put this in terms that the audience understands in terms of how I speak?
Absolutely.
So basically, think of it like this, you all. The United Nations and the World Economic Forum, the most powerful leaders in the world come together and they have a visioning session on how they're going to transform and change our lives. And it's not a, hey, let's bring in a few people from Chicago, a few people from New York, a few people from LA and see what they think. This is, and think about it like this. This is what the wealthiest, most powerful people are crafting in terms of vision for how the rest of the world will fit into their vision or their economic plan. Is that you get where I'm going, Jeff? Would you say I said anything inaccurate?
No, that's exactly right. And
okay.
And it stated enough how these are heads of state, these are heads of the biggest corporations. They're some of the most influential people in the world that are all part of these discussions.
Yes. So you were saying?
Yeah. So a big driver, it's probably no secret to anybody at this point, a big driver for the majority of these organizations, specifically the UN and the World Economic Forum, are related to climate change. So I don't want to debate whether you agree with it or whether you don't agree with it. It just is that's the primary motive behind these two groups. And so as part of trying to solve for that, they have come up with this idea. And again, you can look at it on their website. It's part of what the United Nations calls Agenda 2030. And they want to transform the way cities work, and specifically to lower carbon footprint of the individual. And this concept is called the 15-minute city. So they put the home or the residence at the center of that circle, and they want you to be able to go to work within 15 minutes. They want you to be able to go to the grocery store within 15 minutes. They want you to be able to go to entertainment within 15 minutes. And so the idea is you have to travel less, so there's less of a carbon footprint. It's a big idea and a huge push that a lot of the United States big cities, I think Chicago is one of them, has signed up for this to say we will work to transform our city into one of these 15-minute cities. And this, again, is globally. France is another one that's doing it. I think Paris is one of the key ones that's going to start working on it. Germany's into it. And so I think you should pay attention to what these people are saying, irrespective of whether you agree with it or not, because it does craft what you might think about doing from an investment perspective. And so you start to pair it together with what we talked about with commercial real estate, and you start to see, okay, well, there could be a pattern here. So to your point of immigration, lots of people don't have a place to stay. We've already talked about how there's a shortage of residential homes in the United States in aggregate. So what I think ends up happening here with some of this office space is that they get converted to residential space. It's already started happening. It's used to house immigrants and
real quick, Jeff, when you say it's already started happening, I want the listeners to understand how this happens, because you can't just take something that's zoned commercial, and I know this from real estate investment, right? Something that's zoned commercial and make it residential, which means that in order for this to happen, that lawmakers are in cahoots and are silently rezoning areas in our cities, and we don't even realize it.
Yeah, that's correct. I'd be very surprised if Chicago hasn't already been doing this, because they're one of the key test cities for the 15-minute city concept. And also, like, you can take a look at this too. This is from October 27th of last year on whitehouse.gov. So this is a new administration push to even help the effort. And right now they've dedicated $3 billion in funding to already assist with this in the major cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco.
Wow. We have the commercial to residential conversion addressing office vacancy slide up from whitehouse.gov, October 27, 2023. And there it says it right there, $3 billion annually. The Community Development Block Grant provides $3 billion annually to support community housing, revitalization projects for low and moderate income families. Wait a second. That would be people listening. But we haven't heard. Have you heard any? Anyway, and new actions making it easier to use these funds for acquisition, pre-development, and construction associated with conversions.
Yeah, I would. So that's the name of the actual article. So this is commercial to residential conversion, addressing office vacancies. If you type that in on whitehouse.gov, you'll come up with the whole article. It's very long. So I try to take excerpts here, and for the purposes of the folks who don't see your screen, they've actually validated some of the things that we talked about. So the opening lines of this are: the COVID-19 pandemic forced Americans to change how they live and work, with ripple effects across the economy. Vacancies persist coast to coast. Vacancy rates have reduced foot traffic to the quote-unquote office-adjacent economy, reducing demand at local businesses, including restaurants, dry cleaners, convenience stores, retailers, hair salons, etc. And so the administration, the White House, has basically said, we're going to dedicate these funds to help with the conversion of office to residential. And so this is $3 billion right here. I think this is just the start. So once the commercial real estate loans and the banks associated with it start getting in greater trouble than they are right now, I believe there will be a new emergency called that will get a heck of a lot more than $3 billion. That will funnel into basically really jumpstart the activity to convert a lot of this office space to residential. That will end up being one of the biggest opportunities, I think, for people that, again, want to restart a restaurant or want to basically see where these development zones are and put in, new retail or whatever kind of businesses that you want.
So what I'm hearing you say, too, is, all right, here's the vision that they cast. Probably not a lot we can do about it. Money's already getting pushed in that direction. 15-minute cities are coming. For entrepreneurs listening, for investors listening, wake up. Let's pay attention to the vision, and how do we, as common people, take advantage of these opportunities to create more opportunity for ourselves and for our community, ultimately. So, Jeff, I want to end the show with just your thoughts on, we shared quite a bit about the predictions from 2020, how that played out. Here we are, 2024. You end the show with another prediction, which is, based on data, really good data. What suggestions do you have for those listening in terms of how they should be moving, given everything we've covered over the last, 90 to 100 minutes or so?
Absolutely. So the first thing I would say goes back to one of the items we talked about, and probably is a residual from 2020. Understand your risk when it comes to the banking organizations that you're working with. I know, again, that we made a decision as Andrew Reese to look at our excess cash because I think the worst day I would ever have as a business owner and leader would be the day that I have to have an all employee conversation and say, hey, I'm very sorry, our bank went insolvent, and therefore I cannot make payroll.
Which was a real story for Roku, if I'm not mistaken. Roku lost millions when Silicon Valley failed, and that was payroll money.
Yeah.
No
worse day as a leader, especially as an organization that's now been around for 20 years. So understand your risk and do what you can to hedge that risk. So if you have a payroll that exceeds that amount, that's covered by FDIC insurance, which is $250,000. And a key thing here, too, that $250,000 is not per account. It's per customer. If you individually have a savings account with $250 and you have another checking account with $250, you're only getting $250. So if you are a corporation, which is also considered a customer, and you have separate accounts at the same organization, you're only getting $250 covered. So that's a key thing. So figure out a way to hedge that risk.
Hold. Jeff, that was big. Because I believe, like many of us, haven't distinguished the difference between being a customer and the account. And you're like, this is per, say it again?
It's per customer. So whether you're coming in as your company or whether you're coming in as an individual. So again,
Per customer.
If I, Jeff Lewandowski, have a savings account with 250 in it, and I have a checking account with 250 in it, all within the same bank, my coverage for FDIC is only 250. So if that bank goes, I'm losing 250,000.
Wow.
So that's a common misconception, is that people just think, hey, well, I'll just have a bunch of accounts at the same organization. It doesn't work that way.
No. So what I'm hearing is the other piece of advice that you're getting is like diversify when it comes to banks. We hear that when it comes to investments, it comes to our investment funds, but ultimately, hey, also when it comes to your bank, if you have over $250,000, you need to be diversifying.
Yes.
Wow. Anything else that you would share in the last 2 minutes?
Yeah, for sure. And so that's a little bit more fun to talk about. I talked about it in the beginning of our conversation, but take a look at things like Apple Vision Pro. I think that when you think about 15-minute cities in conjunction with other investments and the policy pushes that are going to happen, it's going to be more in tune with, I think, that whole what they talk about with Web3. So I think there's going to be a lot of exciting opportunity either as an entrepreneur to develop some of the elements that exist to support Web3 or those virtual environments, or companies that you can invest in that are actually looking at it and really making strides, like Apple with its Apple Vision Pro. Those are some really exciting parts to take a look at, and I think that's going to be a growth opportunity moving forward.
Hey, my inspired peoples. Linnell Harris here, certified ontological coach and trainer. I'm so excited that you're watching the channel. By the way, did you know you can catch the show live at 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. every Sunday morning? You can. All you have to do is go to my Facebook stream, Coach Linnell Harris, catch the stream live, or you can listen to the radio show via iHeart at WVON 1690 AM. But since you're here, if you love the content, I ask that you share it, like this particular video, and subscribe to the channel. I hope you're having a great day.